Hank Hartley was born in a small suburb where his father was the worship pastor at a local church. In fact, Hank learned to play the guitar from someone in the church, and before you knew it, he was actually, every Sunday, he was on the worship team. He went to high school in that small suburb. He went to college and he graduated. And after college, he took a job in the finance and banking sector where the money was fairly good, and he was pretty intelligent. He made his way up through the ranks and was making a fairly substantial living in the finance industry. But his heart wasn't in finance. You see, his heart was always in music. So Hank would go into the bigger town, and he would actually visit all the clubs, and he would hear all the latest music. And in fact, Hank Hartley was quite well known by the ladies. But eventually, over time, he just decided to leave the high-end banking job and attempt to pursue a career in music. So, after leaving the banking sector, he made a living playing in bands around the area, but it was just enough to get by. It was never enough to get ahead. But then he had this great opportunity. You see, this was back before the whole global crisis that shut everything down. And so this opportunity was in a cruise line. The cruise lines were still up and running at that time. They were looking for musicians to play as entertainment on these cruises that were always packed. So Hank, he became a musician on one of these major cruise lines, and he was able to see the world. Whenever they were important at these exotic locations, Hank would make sure to disembark with the passengers, and he'd hit the clubs, and he'd enjoy the music scene. He was living his best life. He was traveling the world, and he was playing music. But then something happened that happens to most all of us at some point. You see, Hank Hartley, he met a girl. Her name was Maria, and her father was a success in the clothing design business, so she actually came from a rather affluent family. Hank and Maria fell in love. Soon after, he proposed to her, and she, of course, said yes, but being a backup musician on cruise lines wasn't enough to give her the life that he wanted, so he decided to pursue some other opportunities. So it was with great excitement when he got some amazing news from his agent. See, the cruise line had been preparing to launch this new cruise for months. They'd been advertising it constantly, and they'd actually made this cruise the centerpiece of their entire new line, and the maiden voyage was just around the corner, and it turned out they needed a front man for the band. The pay was good, not great, but he and Maria discussed it with their agent, and they decided that even though the pay was not great, just good, the opportunities to be seen as a frontman for this band on this major cruise, well, the opportunity for exposure that would lead to even greater opportunities as a musician was too great to pass up. So it was with great reluctance that Hank and Maria said goodbye, and they were separated so shortly after their engagement. But as I said, the opportunity to be a frontman on this cruise was just too great. So Hank took the gig and left on the trip. And on the trip, he carried with him a special gift from Maria, a guitar with a silver plate on the back of the body reading to Hank on the occasion of our engagement. Everything was going great on this cruise. For the first couple days, Hank and his band were killing it, and the passengers were loving it. But then, a few days into the trip, something happened that changed everything. Hank awoke to the sound of alarms going off throughout the ship. He ran from his room and made his way to the main deck where everything was chaos. Passengers were all about in a state of confusion. Some were in shock, and others were in terror as the ship, this huge cruise liner, began to lilt. Hank realized at that point that the ship was in great peril, and as he saw crew members attempting to get the lifeboats down and loaded, he realized even more. He realized that they were sinking. As the passengers began to come to the same realization that the ship was indeed sinking, they began to panic, and the task of filling the lifeboats became even more difficult. Thinking quickly, Hank gathered his band together on the deck, and he directed them to play a slow dance song in order to ease the panic of the passengers and allow them to more efficiently be loaded into the lifeboats. So with that, after giving the order to his band on the deck of the sinking ship, he reached down and he picked up his violin. You see, the whole story is true. I only changed one thing. The musical instrument bearing his beloved Maria's inscription was not a guitar, but it was a common and cheap German violin. The night was April 15th, 1912, and the great opportunity, Hank, or Wallace Henry, as he was called, well, the great opportunity was as the bandmaster on the greatest cruise ship the world had ever seen, the Titanic. The eyewitness reports stated that Wallace Hartley led his band on the deck of the Titanic in the playing of a soothing waltz as the passengers made their way into the lifeboats. The last sight of Henry Hartley, Wallace Henry Hartley, was as the waves swept over him into the sea along with his bandmates. Over 1,500 people died that night, but many of the survivors spoke of the handsome young man playing his violin as they made their way to escape. They spoke of the calming effect it had in the midst of chaos, allowing many to more efficiently be loaded into the waiting lifeboats, saving their lives. 10 days later, Wallace's body was found in the frigid waters. His violin, encased in a leather satchel, was strapped to his chest. The violin was shipped to Maria back in their homeland of England, and more than 1,000 people attended his funeral, while thousands more waited along the procession route. Wallace was honored with a 10-foot headstone above his grave, and at its base, there was carved a violin. Maria never married. In 2006, a man discovered an old, damaged violin in his attic. Upon examining it, he realized it was no ordinary violin. So he contacted an auction house, and they set about on the years-long, arduous process of authenticating the story of this violin. Until in 1913, its identity as Wallace Henry Hartley's violin was confirmed. So at that point, this violin was put up for auction, and it sold. This violin, cheap in its time, bought for not that much, a German violin from fiancé to her fiancé departing on a voyage. Well, it sold in 2013 for $1.7 million. I love this story. It's one of my favorite stories I've ever heard, the story of heroism, the story of this man. And it's actually become legend. Some people have thought perhaps what he was playing was Nearer My God to Thee, but they believe it was actually a waltz that he was playing. When I said that it was in the time before the global crisis hit and cruises were huge, well, most of you should know it was right before the war to end all wars, World War I, when the sea became a dangerous place I just love the story. But I love this, and this is what I want to share with you guys today. You see, we're all in such a hurry to get back to things, and we're stuck in our houses, or we're stuck with the task of just the ordinary. And I want you to consider that what Wallace Henry Hartley did that day was in many ways ordinary. You think, no way, absolutely. He was a musician. His ordinary life of getting up and playing his violin was ordinary to him, quite ordinary. In the middle of this chaos and the crisis, what he decided to do was simply what he had always done, was the ordinary task of playing the violin. However, what I want you to truly consider is this: ordinary things done with extraordinary faithfulness add immeasurable value to the things they touch. With that in mind, I would challenge everybody out there this week to consider, what ordinary things have you neglected? What ordinary things do you get up every day and perhaps fail to see the value in? And I would challenge you to understand that these ordinary things, the parent checking on their children at night, the parent going as we're back to school again, going after long graveyard shifts, but then getting up to chaperone a trip to the zoo, which will happen again. The ordinary things of a mother consoling a child after a breakup. The ordinary things of loving words spoken. The ordinary things of people in this town who've committed their lives to working in mills and getting up at 2 a.m. to drive log trucks, the ordinary things that we see as just ordinary. I want you to understand that these ordinary things, done with extraordinary faithfulness, will always one day add immeasurable value to the lives they touch. And that is my challenge for myself. In the business of just doing all these things that I feel like I need to do, that I'll just do this today because it's what I did yesterday, to take one more look today, to take a new look at the ordinary and realize in my own life, and for you guys, I'll say it once more, to realize that the ordinary things done with extraordinary faithfulness, well, they will add immeasurable greatness to the things they touch. So this week, when you consider the lives you touch, keep that in mind and never grow weary of doing good. Because in the appointed time, it will reap a harvest.